again future conferences. Well, as a first approach of this business model just mentioned by our Professor Ralph, we would like to apply this approach to the food security with a special focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Well, let's first define what is food security. Food security is not about having safe food to eat. It's one of the things comprised in food security, but we are also talking about having enough and quality food to eat. So we are talking about including in this approach the undernourishment, the overnourishment, also the global food trade, the availability and access to the resources to produce the food, and also the waste that happen across the whole value chain. How all these pieces interact together, beginning with the farming process, either small-scale or large-scale farming. Taking a look on small-scale farming, we look like today small farmers are being squeezed by two forces. One is the access to the resources they need, and the other, the price competition, bringing prices down because of the global trade. So today, small farmers are not being able to meet the need of the undernourished population, while industrial farming has been able to do it. Let's take a look at sub-Saharan Africa. What challenges is this region facing? We have 1/4 of the population that is undernourished. We have also a growing population that will hit the 2 billion people by 2050. We have unused resources and also the lowest crop productivity of the world. It's the region with the lowest crop productivity even when compared with other developing countries. The crop productivity in sub-Saharan Africa remained stagnant over about 25 years, and when the productivity began to pick up, it did it at a slower rate, and it still is a slower rate than other developing countries. And not even if we compare with developed countries, where actually the difference in productivity is 100-fold. What is the impact of agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa? Well, there is the undernourishment issue, but there is also an economic issue that impacts the whole country. Why? Because different from developing countries, where the agriculture accounts for 1 to 3% of the GDP, in these countries, it's about 17-18% of the GDP. So improvements in agriculture impact heavily the national income. And also we have an imbalance. While 25% of the land for arable land in the world is in this region, only 10% of the agricultural output comes from this region. So it's, again, we have a mismatch between the available resources and the potential. And also, how is the business structure, how farming is structured in this region? 85% of the farms are small farms of less than 2 hectares each. So they cannot benefit from the business that industrial large-scale farming does, from the economies of scale, the access to better seeds, the access to financing, and also to use technology and better infrastructure. What does the region need to be successful in a business of large-scale farming? Well, the key success factors for large-scale farming are over 3 pillars. That is procurement, production, and distribution. As first steps, in the side of procurement, the area should focus on seed sourcing, high-quality seeds that can improve the yield, and also install irrigation systems and train the workforce. These 3 factors would improve the yield and improve also the competitiveness in price, because price is the most important driver in the market of agricultural products. Well, what are the fronts that have worked? We have 2 fronts to work on. The institutional, we're talking about governments, foundations, and also the individual farming approach. In the institutional side, we need to do investments in infrastructure, research and development, labor force, and regulation. We need changes in all of these approaches. All of them will give you different improvements. In this case, just to give you an example, in the case of R&D, and a study of the U.S. Department of Agriculture calculated that if seeds and crops would be adapted to the region, if doubling the spending in R&D for this improvement, the output would increase by 7%. And we have several other changes required that could increase the productivity by 20% without increasing the land area. Also, on the side of the small farmer, the focus is to increase the yield would be in having a better equipment, special irrigation, and also the seeds. So we have an overlap between the areas that should be priority in institutions and individual farmers. So now my colleague Emil will walk you through these opportunities.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to take a closer look in two of potentially game-changing solutions for Africa: irrigation and better seeds. And I do hope that me standing here, you can still see part of the screen. Let's look in irrigation first. If I invite you to take a quick look at the map of the world on your left, you can actually see the density of irrigation systems in cultivated lands around the world. It doesn't take much time to understand that Africa is by far the laggard in this space. And we know that, going back as early as the civilizations of Mesopotamia, that successful agriculture is intrinsically linked with irrigation. We actually know that the same piece of land could yield 2 to 3 times more in comparison to rain-fed field of land. And our question is why Africa is not taking benefit of this equipment that has been around for centuries. You heard my colleagues saying that the agriculture of Africa is dominated by small-scale farming. The average farmer is living under the poverty line, which means that those people have hardly the means to sustain themselves, let alone invest in new equipment. But if you look at the investment side of things, it's quite a clear-cut story that one can make of what is the increased productivity of whatever type of irrigation you might choose to use, and the cost that one needs to put in front. Now, you might ask yourselves, okay, it's clear that people in Africa don't have the means, but why don't big corporations flock the continent to exploit this opportunity? Now, to answer this question, we need to step into some price distorting phenomena which actually play a heavy role on the return of those investments. You might be feeling where I'm heading for. I'm going to speak about subsidies. It is an important piece, and we need this piece to understand the whole picture. Because the fate of the farmer of Africa is not only defined by what's happening in Africa, but it has to do with the behavior of those big players on the world markets. Now, take a look at this graph. On the x-axis, you can see the time horizon. On the y-axis, you can see the subsidies as percentage of the farmer's revenue. The blue one is the OECD countries, red is China, gray is India. Even though the matured markets have been decreasing their subsidy levels, they still represent roughly 20% of the gross receipts of a farmer nowadays. It's quite similar when we look in the big heavyweights coming on the global food stage. Brazil has doubled its spending on subsidies. China has tripled it in the last 5 years. Same has done India. Now, how is this affecting sub-Saharan Africa? Just imagine, this is keeping on the market, otherwise less competitive supply, which obviously pushes the prices down. And this is confirmed by the next graph. If you can just focus on the gray line here, you can just confirm the downward trend of prices in the second part of the last century. Graphs are all good, and I'm sure you have had enough of those. but they rarely explain what's the actual impact on the livelihood of millions of people. And to get to this part of the story, I would use the example of the early 2000s of Burkina Faso and the cotton crisis. Burkina Faso, a country in Western Africa, at that time of 12 million population, had 2 million of those depend on the production of cotton. Now, Burkina Faso was naturally better in terms of productivity of producing cotton. They could produce a kilogram of cotton for 47 cents. The United States at the time were producing the same cotton for $1.61. Now, this comes as a surprise when we actually realize that the United States more than doubled its exports in the early 2000s of cotton. How did it happen? United States poured $3.9 billion of subsidies to cotton producers. To put things in perspective, this is an amount higher than the entire GDP of Burkina Faso. So obviously, Burkina Faso and any country in West Africa is not in the same position to subsidize production as those countries are. And this reduces the return on investment if somebody decides to go and put money in the African continent. Ironically, the United States provided development aid to Burkina Faso of $2 billion in the same year. Now, we can use any developed country to make this point. That's not the objective of this presentation. What we want to bring to your attention is those externalities that we need to take into account if we're thinking about investments in agriculture, for example. So it's not about the IRR or the NPV of the irrigation systems. There is more at play, and we wanted to show you this piece of the story. Now, we spoke a bit about irrigation. Let's look in the seeds. Africa needs to feed 15% of the population of the world, but it only represents 2% of the GMO market. Now, if we take GMOs as a proxy of innovation in the agricultural space, why is Africa not taking advantage of this biotechnological innovation? Only 2 countries right now in sub-Saharan Africa, Burkina Faso and South Africa, are using GMOs. And if this was to change, one can argue that millions of lives could be saved, yield could be improved, and nutritional value could be boosted. Let us look quickly in 2 examples. First of all, rice. 400 million people eat rice every day around the world in emerging countries. 220 million of those are suffering from vitamin A deficiency. There is a seed out there that offers enriched content of provitamin A. And if this was to be used, the estimations are that the lives of 1 million children under the age of 5 could be saved. So this is just one example of how using these advanced biotechnological solutions, one could improve nutritional value of the crops. Now let me jump to another example, which is a staple crop in Western Africa, the cowpea. The cowpea, the harvest of cowpea is actually impacted by an insect called Maruca pod borer. This is putting at risk the livelihoods of many people in Africa today. And there is already a solution that offers resistance to the same insect, but it's not being used. If it was to be used, one can expect increases of productivity of up to 70%. This would also reduce the use of the conventional spray pesticides that are right now applying, with 67% as well. So this is just to give you 2 pieces of examples of how those innovations could improve the story of Africa today. Again, we're not here to throw at you easy solutions. We wanted to ask ourselves the question, but why is this not being done? And what are the obstacles for this being implemented? And here we're not going to speak about finance, actually. Some of the companies in this space offer different schemes of how this could be financed. But probably there is something else at play which could be even harder to change. And this probably has to do with mindset. We're going to look in 2 dimensions here: the openness towards innovation and the education. Now, the attitude towards innovation, we chose to show 2 extremes. Let me give you a quick example with Kenya. Kenya, 2 years ago, chose to ban the imports of GMOs for the next 10 years. Now, whether this is right or wrong is not the point here. We're not going to open this discussion. What is interesting in this example is that they did so only on the basis of a single report issued by a European scientist. And the interesting bit here is that this report was heavily contested later on and was actually retracted. Even though it was retracted, the ban is still in force for the next 7 years. So if this is the one side of the extreme towards attitude in terms of innovation, if we take GMOs as a proxy for innovation right now, we can look at another extreme at the same spectrum. United States, 88% of their maize production is actually based off GMO seeds. We are not here to argue which one is the step forward. The question here is that one can argue that Africa is probably not in the position to take extreme positions. They're not in the position to fall in the trap of the politicized debate that the European Union is probably having about GMOs, simply because Africa has much different stake in this discussion. Europe or US will find a way to feed their population with or without GMOs. Probably is not the same when we speak about Africa. So the point we're trying to make is that we need a pragmatic approach and decision-making weighing the consequences of implementing innovation and the consequences of not doing so. And this should be on a standalone basis and not being swayed by heated, sometimes romanticized or politicized discussions in the developed world. The second piece is regarding education. I'm sure you don't need too much convincing that this part of the region suffers from lack of education in big terms. And any comparison with developed country is easy to make. Now, it comes as no surprise, given those two, that productivity is more than 150 times lower per worker basis of value-added terms when we compare US and Kenya. And there is research out there showing that investment in education actually have quite direct correlation to the increase in productivity that one can expect. So this is an important piece to be considered going forward for this industry. Now, we quickly spoke about many things. Let us try to put everything into perspective. We open up speaking about food production and the food security. We chose to speak about industrial farming in sub-Saharan Africa, simply because this is a region abundant with labor and great natural endowments, and still it's lagging behind in productivity. Second, we made a number of comments which help us understand that once a player establishes itself in large-scale farming, probably they're going to enjoy low substitution potential because of the scale they're going to achieve, because of the high entry barriers, because of lack of rivalry in this space right now. We spoke about the key success factors related to seeds, to irrigation, to education and mindset. And we said that the first step probably to change things in Africa is going from small scale to large scale, or so to say horizontal integration. And hopefully this would allow to African farmers to centralize procurement and commercial function so that hopefully they could offset the negative impacts of externalities such as trade that we discussed. We should never forget about the external factors that are going to influence this industry. We have the positive influence of growing population, which is obviously going to drive demand. We have technology boosting factors in terms of seeds and farming technology. And we have other considerations to not to lose sight of, such as the trade regulations, such as education, investment in infrastructure, and the whole mindset of the government. We hope that this helped you gain a bit of perspective of large-scale farming in Africa, but even more so, to put the industry analysis model into perspective and show how it could be used. Hopefully, you could find a ways to adopt this to your industry and start a discussion. Before I invite the next group, I would actually ask for your comments and questions. Thank you.